Money is money, and paper is paper. All the invention of man cannot make them otherwise. With those words, Thomas Paine went after what he saw as one of the greatest scams in history. Governments claiming that paper is money. We all know Paine from Common Sense and quotes like, "These are the times that try men's souls." But he also delivered one of the most brutal takedowns of paper money ever written. So on this episode, we're diving into Thomas Paine's completely forgotten and totally ignored demolition of this fraud. And by the end, I think you're going to understand why he said, "The evils of paper money have no end." But first of all, before getting to that, welcome. And thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Friday, September 5th, 2025. And Paine started out with a pretty simple truth that cuts through centuries of government BS. Gold and silver are the emissions of nature. Paper is the emission of art. And he explained in some detail the key properties of what makes something money. First of all, money's value must come from a source that is outside of human control. That's what makes it stable, and that's what makes it trustworthy. He said the value of gold and silver is ascertained by the quantity which nature has made in the earth. We cannot make that quantity more or less than it is, and therefore the value being dependent upon the quantity depends not on man. Human nature means, well, humans are kind of untrustworthy when they have power and wealth and control, and people who seek that will manipulate those systems to expand that. Anyways, man, he said, has no share in making gold and silver. All that his labors and ingenuity can accomplish is to collect it from the mine, refine it for use, and give it an impression or stamp it into coin. Next, he pointed out that its value has to be intrinsic, and even a government stamp doesn't give it value, it just gives it some convenience or usefulness. He said it's being stamped into coin adds considerably to its convenience, but nothing to its value. Zero, nothing at all. The value is there without the government stamp as well. He said it has then no more value than it had before. Its value is not in the impression, but in itself. Take away the impression and still the same value remains. And then finally, it has to be lasting and completely durable. He said, alter it as you will, or expose it to any misfortune that can happen. Still, the value is not diminished. It has a capacity to resist the accidents that destroy other things. Now, Paine couldn't be more clear. All of those properties are 100% required for something to be money. He said, nothing which has not all those properties can be fit for the purposes of money. And then, of course, he explained that paper doesn't have any of those properties. He said paper, considered as a material whereof to make money, has none of the requisite qualities in it. It's too plentiful and too easy to come at, and it can be had anywhere and for a trifle. So Paine was very clear. Paper absolutely could not be money. And thinking that paper is money, Paine basically called that a fantasy. Let's go back to that quote from the beginning. Money is money. He's citing a German farmer that he had met who said this. Money is money and paper is paper. That's the quote he remembered. And he continued, all the invention of man cannot make them otherwise. The alchemist may cease his labors, and the hunter after the philosopher's stone go to rest, if paper can be metamorphosed into gold and silver, or made to answer the same purpose in all cases. From there, Paine went hard describing all kinds of evils that arise when you use paper as money. First of all, it's just an illusion. It looks real, but it has no real substance. So in reality, it's just a scam. He said, when an assembly undertake to issue paper as money, the whole system of safety and certainty is overturned and property set afloat. Paper notes given and taken between individuals as a promise of payment is one thing, but paper issued by an assembly as money is another thing. I like this comparison, this analogy. He said, it is like putting an apparition in the place of a man. It vanishes with looking at it, and nothing remains but the air. Second, paper money, a paper money system, turns pretty much everyone into speculators and gamblers. He said it turns the whole country into stock jobbers. The precariousness of its value and the uncertainty of its fate continually operate night and day to produce this destructive effect. And because of the competition that this creates, it also breaks down the moral fiber of the entire society. He said, having no real value in itself, it depends for support upon accident, caprice, and party. And as it is the interest of some to depreciate at the time for Thomas Paine meant print more of it. The more money you have in circulation, the less purchasing power it has. So they didn't call it inflation then. They were very straightforward. The money was being depreciated by having too much supply. So it's the interest of some to depreciate and of others to raise its value. There is a continual invention going on that destroys the morals of a country. And one of the most immoral things that happens in that type of a scenario, and maybe this will sound familiar, it sure does to me, is you get a set of powerful people always demanding more printing presses, more money being thrown into the supply. It's the scammer's playbook that we see all around us today. He said there are a set of men who go about making purchases upon credit and buying estates they have not wherewithal to pay for. And having done this, their next step is to fill the newspapers with paragraphs of the scarcity of money and the necessity of a paper emission. Now, that was in comparison to having money and needing paper in order to pay all those bills. These days, they just want to force down interest rates, increase the money supply, and the like. It's the same end result, but you're not even comparing paper with money. It's paper with more paper. Anyways, then they work to have a legal tender under the pretense of supporting its credit and went out to depreciate it as fast as they can, get a deal of it for a little price, and then cheat their creditors. And this is the concise history of paper money schemes. Now, for the rest of us, it's really just a massive bubble, and bubbles burst. He said paper money is like dram drinking. It relieves for a moment by deceitful sensation, but gradually diminishes the natural heat and leaves the body worse than it found it. This is the best. It is a bubble, and the attempt vanity. What happens in a paper money bubble? Depreciation. Money printer go burr. The more you print, the less purchasing power it has, the less it's worth. Paine said this gives the appearance of things being dear when they are not so in fact. For in the same proportion that any kind of money falls in value, articles rise in price. And this is a great reason why we always reject here at the TAC, we reject the term inflation as it's used today. Inflation, properly defined, is an increase in the supply of money and credit, but most people use it to describe price increases that are the result of that. When you use the term from the founders, from people like Thomas Paine, depreciation, it becomes much more clear what the source of the problem is. Who's making this money worth less, which causes all my stuff to cost more? Now, he explained in some detail, but I'll just give a brief passage here, how this played out during the War for Independence, and it was pretty bad. He said the paper money, though issued from Congress under the name of dollars, did not come from that body always at that value. It started out awesome and went downhill fast. He said those which were issued the first year were equal to gold and silver. The second year less, the third still yet less, and so on. for nearly the space of 5 years. And it kept getting worse and worse and worse, and the depreciation created a pretty dire situation. It's where we got the phrase from the continental dollar, not worth a continental. They were printing so much of it, you could barely afford to buy anything. I mean, not like wheelbarrows full of it, but Thomas Paine lived through this, and he gave a pretty extreme example of what he had to do. He said paper money in America fell so much in value from this excessive quantity of it that in the year 1781, I gave 300 paper dollars for one pair of worsted stockings. Now, mind you, those were fancy ones at the time, probably, but still $300 for a pair of stockings in 1781, no matter how fancy they are, that's a lot of dollars. He said, what I write you upon the subject is experience and not merely opinion. And then even worse, once you get into this cycle, the cycle keeps feeding itself. It's a negative feedback loop that gets worse and worse and worse, and it drives out the real money. People just use more and more of the paper. What some of you might be aware of, that's called Gresham's Law. He said the natural effect of increasing and continuing to increase paper currencies is that of banishing the real money. The shadow takes place of the substance till the country is left with only shadows in its hands. Now, here's the twist. Paine was obviously no dummy. He was against the fraud of governments, primarily anyone, making paper as money. Now, it's even worse, of course, when it's backed up by government force. But he wasn't against paper as a medium at all. He said the only proper use for paper in the room of money is to write promissory notes and obligations of payment in specie upon. So it's just an IOU, a promissory note. Here's 20. If I'm passing this to you, this can be turned in and collected. You can collect real money for it. He said a piece of paper thus written and signed is worth the sum it is given for. He said the value, therefore, of such a note is not the note itself, because the note is just a note. It's just a piece of paper. It's not actually money. The value of such a note is not the note itself, for that is but paper and promise, but in the man who is obliged to redeem it with gold or silver. I know you won't be surprised by this, but Paine explained that paper money only survives with the threat of government violence through legal tender laws, which I guess is kind of redundant there. He said, if anything had or could have a value equal to gold and silver, it would require no tender law. In other words, no law to require someone to accept it as money. Because if it had the value, you'd voluntarily do that. He said, and if it had not that value, it ought not to have such a law. And because of this, all tender laws are tyrannical and unjust and calculated to support fraud and oppression. And if you think about this guy, Thomas Paine, one of the people who really sparked the American Revolution, the War for Independence, he's referring to anyone claiming to make paper into money, any government doing this, as exercising arbitrary power. Arbitrary power was one of the so-called grievances, the injuries and usurpations in the Declaration of Independence. This is government really just doing whatever it wants outside of the rules, on no legal authority, no moral authority. It's total tyranny. He said, as to the assumed authority of any assembly in making paper money, or paper of any kind of legal tender, or in other language, a compulsive payment, and that's his issue there, compelling people to accept something as money. He said, it is a most presumptuous attempt at arbitrary power. There can be no such power in a Republican government. The people have no freedom and property, no security where this practice can be acted. Now, wherever paper is money in any society under any government, the damage is massive. It's been that way all through history. It was that way during the American Revolution. It's that way today. It will be that way in the future. It's always massive. Paper money absolutely destroys the entire foundation of any good and moral society. He said its uncertain and fluctuating value is continually awakening or creating new schemes of deceit. Every principle of justice is put to the rack, and the bond of society dissolved. The suppression, therefore, of paper money might very properly have been put into the act for preventing vice and immorality. So he's really just saying, like, if you want to, prevent or prohibit immorality, there's no better place to do that than by prohibiting paper as money. Now, his view is that people who support a paper money system are either criminals or maybe they're just delusional because they believe that a nation cannot be exhausted while there is paper and ink enough to print paper money. In other words, you'll always be rich and happy, just keep turning on that money printer and everything's going to be fine. But this, he said, was just smoke and mirrors, and it all eventually leads to bankruptcy for basically everyone. He said every new emission, until the delusion bursts, that's the bubble popping, will appear to the nation an increase in wealth. Y'all think you're rich during the boom. Everyone thinks they're doing well, but that's just delusional. He said every merchant's coffers will appear a treasury, and he will swell with paper riches till he becomes a bankrupt. Now, I don't know if this next piece was just hyperbole at the end, but let's hear from Thomas Paine, who tells us how he really feels about it. He said, but tender laws of any kind operate to destroy morality and to dissolve by the pretense of law what ought to be the principle of law to support: reciprocal justice between man and man. But get this, and the punishment, he said, of a member who should move for such a law ought to be death. Thomas Paine did not mess around. And here's the final verdict. No matter what the excuse, no matter what the scheme, no matter what the reason, no matter what they do, paper money always ends the same way. Evil that never stops. He said the evils of paper money have no end. If you're anything like me, you never learned any of this in the government-run and government-approved so-called education system. They don't teach any of this stuff. And that's a big reason why we work so hard every single day in and day out, month in and month out, year in and year out. We just hit our 19-year anniversary over the summer. We're rolling into 2026. And we work super hard to reach and teach more and more people every single day about these essential foundational principles from the founders, from the old revolutionaries, plus the great thinkers that they read and learned from. And absolutely nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that quickly devaluing, dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way. We make amazing use of it. We punch way above our weight class here at the 10th Amendment Center. Our membership program starts out at just $2 a month. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. It's all spelled out. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. You can also send us a check if you prefer to send us some real money, like gold back, for example. We love that more than anything. So I appreciate any consideration you can give to joining us today. But if you don't want to become a member, that's totally cool, especially if you want to still help us out financially, just with a one-time gift, or if you're already a member. First of all, thank you for that. And you want to pitch in again, I want to make sure you know how to do that. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. Of course, there's a bunch of free and easy peasy things you can do to help us spread the word, primarily by triggering the algorithms of the platforms you may watch or listen on, primarily the mainstream ones. Hitting the like button, subscribe, get notifications, reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platforms. Comments are a real big one. And then on places like YouTube, watch time percentage is massive. So if it's a 20-minute video and you watch it for 10 minutes, that's only 50%. So they may think we're not all that awesome. But if you watch it 20 minutes or 30 minutes or 40 minutes, 200% would be really great. I think you get the idea there. So I'm very grateful for any consideration you give to helping us out, whether it's financial, otherwise, combination of the above. That's all fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it was interesting. I hope it was entertaining. But more important than anything, I hope it made you think, and I hope you learned something. Again, I really appreciate you being here. I hope you have an awesome weekend, and I look forward to seeing you next week here on the Path to Liberty.